Sabah al-Khair. Good morning. We are really honored to have you with us for this first session of this distinguished conference organized by the Emirates Policy Center, focused on the UAE and COP28 and moving towards a global consensus confronting climate change. I have a very distinguished panel with us today, but I'd like to start, before I introduce them, just to make some few remarks and introduce myself. My name is Cherfane. I am director of the Arab Center for Climate Change Policy at the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Western Asia in Beirut. My position's a new one, because in the Arab region, we didn't talk about climate change 10, 15 years ago. Our first declaration by the Council of Arab Ministers responsible for the environment was issued just in 2008. So we are rather neophytes when we come to this issue for the Arab region, while the world has been talking about it since the adoption of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change back in 1992. But we have evolved on this front, and I'd like to highlight 3 points before we go into our distinguished panel that are important for the region and the globe. First, climate change is upon us. The Paris Agreement talks about a 1.5 degrees Celsius, maintaining that below by the end of the century. In this region, since the beginning of this century, since just 25 years ago, our temperatures have already increased by 0.8 degrees Celsius. Climate change is now. We are seeing this with the droughts. We are seeing with the flash floods. Libya, the flash floods that happened in Libya just several months ago are still fresh in our mind, as much as the conflicts are in Gaza and what's happening in Ukraine. Tens of thousands of people lost their lives in Libya because the government wasn't thinking about climate. They weren't investing in infrastructure. And we weren't thinking about the extremes. Climate change is not only about thinking about end-of-century goals, but thinking about problems facing now. So as we have our discussions, I'd like to highlight 4 points. First, a just and inclusive transition is necessary. All countries have the right to development. Development requires energy. How we do that transition, how we make it sustainable, is the question before us. I think there is universal consensus that a transition is needed. The question, how do we ensure that the haves and the have-nots across countries and within countries, those who do not have access to basic energy and electricity in rural areas, and that exist in the Arab world as much as in other developing and least developed countries around the globe, how do they have access to energy? Is it renewables, or is it the new technologies like green hydrogen or blue hydrogen? Mauritania signing the largest project ever on green hydrogen just a few weeks ago, alongside Oman, Saudi Arabia, Egypt. Second, adaptation is essential. We can't think about mitigation without adaptation. Adaptation means not only addressing the hazard, but also a whole of economy, whole of society, whole of government approach that thinks about how we adapt our societies to the change that is already before us. That involves knowledge, economics, access to technology, addressing vulnerable groups across the board. Fourth, and we have our experts here with us, is climate finance. No one can do this without the resources and the technologies to move forward, but finance is the key. Globally, we failed. There's a $100 billion commitment that was negotiated, that was supposed to be achieved, and that's $100 billion annually for climate. It has not realized. And right now, we have even those contributing to those discussions thinking about a new comprehensive qualified goal for looking beyond the targets right now to better mobilize climate finance across the board to move forward. And then finally, we have to think of not only inclusive approaches, as is very much championed by the UAE here, but also integrated approaches. Climate change, I think we've all now recognized, is not an environment story. It might have started as an environment story, but it is really a whole of economy story. It involves economics, development pathways, social justice, gender issues, and how to put those all together in a package that we collectively can move forward with achieving our common climate goals that also allow us to achieve our national aspirations. The question now is who does what, who is responsible for what, and how we can achieve consensus to move forward. So with that, I am delighted to have a very distinguished panel with us today. And I will start on my left-hand side here with Mr. Zaheer Fakir, who has been advising negotiators and negotiations for several decades now. He is a senior advisor for negotiations of the UN COP28 presidency, but he has been working in South Africa and with the climate change processes of the UNFCCC as a member and the co-chair of the Standing Committee for Finance, and also advising governments and the Africa Group on how to move forward with positioning developing countries in the negotiations on climate. So I'm going to kindly introduce you. You have 5-6 minutes to give a framework, please, on what are the main components and issues on the COP28 agenda, what are the main challenges that the conferences could face, what are the projections for climate justice as we move forward, climate finance, and indeed the energy shift, and with COP28 as the host nation and the presidency, how can the UAE facilitate this dialogue between rich and developing countries? Over to you, Mr. Fakir.
Thank you very much, Carol. I hope this mic is working properly.
It's working.
Thank you very much, and excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak to you. I must confess first, I've been a negotiator in the climate process. I've also been the lead finance negotiator for the G77 and China. And part of the problems you have is probably due to my negotiation skills. I didn't do a good job about it. I'm currently now working together with the UAE COP presidency team, advising them and advising the Emirati negotiators that are part of the team that will be working on COP28. From my perspective, maybe I should start from 6 points that I think would be very crucial for the success of COP28. The first point is solidarity. Now, solidarity, and we've heard it mentioned earlier before, it's a point that came up often in the pre-COP discussions before, and we've had these moments of solidarity. We had the moments of solidarity in Rio when we coined the convention. We had these moments of solidarity in Kyoto, in Paris, and not least Sharm el-Sheikh when we took the historic decision to establish the Loss and Damage Fund. But you should recognize that this is the 28th session of the COP. It is the 18th session of the Kyoto Protocol, and it's the 5th session of the Paris Agreement, and yet we sit today and say that we are not making a difference. So we need to regain that solidarity in a highly divided world that we live in today. And from the pre-COP, what we recognize is that there are differences of perspectives in what considers solidarity. If you speak to some, the solidarity means forgetting historical past and responsibility and shared responsibility going forward. For others, it's about addressing the historical responsibility and supporting them to have the same development space as they transition to much more lower carbon and climate resilient development pathways. The second point is promises. And throughout the COP process, we've had numerous promises. Carol has just alluded to the 100 billion. I was in Copenhagen when they came up with the two commitments, the Fast Start commitment of 30 billion, the 100 billion by 2020. We didn't meet it. We're now in the second part of the promise, which was in the Paris, where we decided that we'd extend the 100 billion per year till 2025. And to today, we can still say that we have not met it. We have a pledge that was made in Glasgow to double adaptation finance, and the last adaptation gap report says that we've actually regressed in terms of that. So promises are something that needs to be addressed. The third point I'd like to make is balance. In every COP, we always talk about the balance. And the balance in our negotiator term is 3 elements: mitigation, adaptation, and means of implementation. When we talk of means of implementation, we talk of finance, technology, and capacity building. And each and every COP, you would find that somebody would always say, we don't have the balance. For those who were in Glasgow, people would say it's a very mitigation-centric COP. You were in Sharm el-Sheikh. You heard some of our colleagues from Europe saying, oh, it was a very adaptation-orientated COP. And important for our COPs is how do you restore that balance? The fourth point I'd like to make is about trust. And if we look at 28 sessions of the COP and 18 sessions of the CMP and 5 sessions of the CMA, being the bodies for these different, we still do not have the trust. The trust has been eroded. Trust does not exist in the process. And you hear it in people speaking when you get. The fifth issue, leadership. We've had erratic forms of leadership. We've had leadership appearing in moments like in Paris and that, but suddenly you have a vacuum again and no leadership when it comes to implementation. So the whole issue of global leadership is the critical issue. And finally, the issue of hope. And hope is where I would see focus on what COP28 needs to be looking at. We've heard from His Excellency Dr. Gagash talking about this being a unique COP and a GST COP, or Global Stocktake COP. It's 5 years since Paris, and we need to take stock of where we are at. When we're looking at this, the UAE COP28 will be looking at a backward and forward-looking assessment of where we are at, but also taking decisions on how can we move forward, correct the course, and have an ambitious outcome. One of the important outcomes of Egypt was the operationalization or the establishment of the Loss and Damage Fund. What the UAE COP has to do is operationalize this fund. And one important thing that has happened here in Abu Dhabi is a few weeks ago, the transitional committee that was established to do the recommendation for operationalizing the fund has concluded its work. It's developed recommendations which will be sent to the COP for adoption. So this is another very important outcome that will be emerging from the COP. But it's not just about operationalizing the fund. We need to be securing pledges for this fund to actually demonstrate that the global community is serious about dealing with the issue of loss and damage. On finance, we need to be delivering on the promises. We need to be delivering on the 100 billion, the doubling of adaptation, but also we need to be looking forward. We need to be sending those positive signals that we are committed to the process. One of which being, how do we decide on the NCQG, and how do we, NCQG being the new goal. We're looking at energy, looking at a new transition in the energy sector. We're looking at lives and livelihoods, food security, etc. But most importantly, what this COP needs to do is restore trust, build the solidarity, deliver on promises, show the leadership that needs to happen, and give the world a hope, as Dr. Gagash talked, for the future generations. Thank you very much, Carol.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fakir. Your experience in this field shows that efforts have been made, but consensus has not been achieved on the way forward. And if I could just also add, while we are looking to get the financing to move forward, we also are dealing with a condition that all of you here are very well aware with, of conflict, fragility, and debt. In the Arab region, despite all its wealth of some countries, we have $1.3 trillion, $1.5 trillion of debt. Now, how can we have the fiscal space to address all those challenges, and looking at this again in that integrated space where it's development, climate goals, and be able to engage public and private sectors in that process forward. So actually looking at that Middle East context, I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Aisha Al-Sarihi, who's a research fellow at the National University of Singapore, who has been writing and researching this for some time. If I could ask you, Dr. Aisha, how can the COP aid efforts in the Middle East and North Africa to fight climate change challenges? And how do we evaluate these net zero emissions, these targets that have been emerging in complementarity, actually, with the Paris Agreement, these national voluntary emissions efforts on net zero? And what are the implications of climate change on development and indeed human security in the region today? Please, you have 6 minutes.
Well, thank you very much, Carol. Good morning, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank the Emirates Policy Center for inviting me to contribute to this timely discussion. Special thanks to Dr. Ibtisam Al-Katbi for having me. As we stand today in a critical juncture to address the impacts of the climate change, we stand today between the 2015 Paris Agreement and our greenhouse gas emission mitigation goal by 2030. We need to focus on reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 43% compared to pre-industrial levels. So, on your questions, Carol, I will start with the last question and then move to the first question. On the impact of the climate change on the development and the human security, the MENA region is one of the most vulnerable regions to the impacts of the climate change. Rising temperature, water scarcity, food security, and extreme weather events such as the heat waves, sands and dust storms, and the cyclones. These are becoming more intense and are happening in a frequent manner. Yet, we tend to think that climate change issues are a separate profile from the development and the human security. In fact, the impacts of the climate change are pretty much linked to all our aspects of our life on a day-to-day basis. It affects the development and it affects the human security. July of this year have been recorded as the hottest month in the history of Earth. The 50 degrees Celsius have been recorded in the UAE and in Saudi Arabia. And in Iran, we have seen 2 days of closure of the public services because of the heat wave and the blackout in electricity. The heat wave is presenting challenges to our development. It presents a challenge to outdoor workers, to their health and the productivity, especially those who work on the construction and the agriculture sector. The ILO expects that the productivity of the of the workers will be reduced by 2%, either because of the it is too hot or because of the low productivity of the workers. Sand and dust storms are also impacting the human and the infrastructure. Last year, the sand and dust storms in Iraq have caused 1 casualty and also caused 5,000 people has been hospitalized because of that. And also because of reduced visibility, there has been implications, in transportation, and there was closure of the flights, as well as closure of the schools and the public services. However, when we speak about the Middle East and North Africa, the region is not a homogeneous region. The 20 countries in the region diverse in terms of the economic size, the natural resources, and as well as the political stability. And those factors are affecting how these countries or how each country is impacted by the climate change and how each country is coping with the impacts of the climate change. Now, in the Gulf region, which is also not a homogeneous region, it has diverse, the countries in the region diverse in their economic size, but the Gulf region has coped very well in dealing with the impacts of the climate change and adopting the technologies that are needed to address the issues of the climate change. And these include technology needed for cooling, the desalination plants, as well as ensuring the food security, even though the agriculture sector is not pretty much capable to support the national security. The Gulf countries also have managed to embark in the economic diversification plans, both the vertical and horizontal approaches of diversification, which help in building the resilience to the looming impacts of the climate change, not only the physical impacts, but also the impacts that are associated with the response to the climate, the climate impacts, which include reducing greenhouse gas emissions. We have seen a progress in developing renewable energy technologies. Ambitious plans to produce the hydrogen are going on in the region. The Gulf countries have ambitiously set net zero targets. That said, and because of climate change issues are transboundary in nature and they can be felt cross-border, the unilateral approaches to address climate change will not be sufficient. The Gulf countries could be also impacted by the implications of the climate change that are taking place in neighboring countries and globally. For example, and we have already been seeing some geopolitical tensions are emerging because of the climate change. We have seen tensions around the sand and dust storms between, for example, Iran and Turkey because of the droughts and the reduce of the rainfall that happens in one country. We are also seeing emerging tensions around shared water resources. Examples include Iran and Iraq around, the Euphrates and Tigris.
Dr. Aisha, please, if you could wrap up, we're going.
My point is, what we need to enhance our regional and global cooperation to address the impacts of the climate change. And the COP28 is a good opportunity to provide the platform for the share of the knowledge, raising awareness, as well as the collaboration between businesses and the government. And what COP28, because it is hosted in the UAE, what it can do, we can come up with concrete solutions that, enhance, I would say, more focusing on the regional cooperation, as well as tapping on the opportunities on the global cooperation.
Thank you very much. And thank you for highlighting the transboundary nature of this story. Climate by nature has no borders, as does water resources. In this region, actually, we have noticed in work we've done under our WICAR initiative that 60% of the Arab region would be vulnerable, highly vulnerable to climate change, specifically because of climate change on water and water-dependent sectors. And that's where issues such as you're mentioning on sand and dust storms, aridity, this has implications for agriculture, livelihoods. A lot of security dimensions with that as well when we think across borders as well. But this is not only a government story, this is also an engagement of civil society, experts like yourself, and of course, global experts. So we are delighted to have Brian Mantlana with us. He is manager of the Holistic Climate Change Impact Area at the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research in South Africa. Brian, this is a global challenge. This is a challenge dealing with developing countries, finding out who is responsible for what. And it requires an evidence-based approach grounded on science, information, and access to that information. Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering, how do you think tanks, research centers, civil society organizations contribute towards shaping and even reshaping the dialogue and the challenge presented by the climate change debate?
Yeah.
Please.
Thanks, Carol. Firstly, I want to thank the organizers for the invitation. This provides a very useful platform for South-South collaboration. So I do not take it lightly that you've invited even myself to participate. Thank you. Before I respond to your questions, Carol, I just want to highlight three things. It's not to highlight them really, it's to remind you, because this is general knowledge. The first one is that climate change is arguably one of the toughest challenges that this current society is facing. That is well known, but it takes me to the second point. In my view, Carol, there's a big gap between what science is telling us and what is the political will to respond to what science is telling us. I call it the valley of death. We know what we should be doing, but there are inherent challenges that make the political elites fail to respond adequately to this challenge. That said, Zaheer, my colleague, mentioned the word hope. I want to say that the UNFCCC process, despite its flaws, and I've written about UNFCCC in published literature papers, I'm a big fan of the United Nations setup, despite its flaws. It's an imperfect, perfect arena to deal with global issues. And the UNFCCC has done a lot to respond to climate change. Without the UNFCCC, we wouldn't be where we are in global response to climate change. It sounds like I'm advocating for UN here. But coming to your point, Carol, I have just 3 quick points to make. Firstly is that in terms of knowledge, science knowledge, one of the things I've picked up in the last decade or so that to me are critical to take forward in the next 5 to 10 years is what I call addressing intersections. While it's good to be an expert in one field, there's a need for us to work at intersection level, where we deal with the political economy, the economy itself, the social dynamics, and try to find a link between these aspects. In my view, if we are to make an impactful contribution to the global response to climate change, we need to learn to work in what I call intersections. Then the other aspect that is important, that I find important, is how we frame issues. In policy work, including climate policy, how we frame issues is very important. Let me give you an example that you may be familiar with. We have sectors that are called hard-to-abate sectors. We've grown, as who work in the climate space, we've grown to accept that they are hard-to-abate sectors. But if you change that framing and say essential to abate sectors, it may change how you address the issue. I'm talking about this in the context of knowledge management and of innovation, of advancing innovation. If we look at these so-called hard-to-abate sectors, but frame them as essential to abate, then we can find ways we can be more innovative in finding solutions. Lastly, Carol, I want to talk about civil society. Now, I'm a research scientist, so I'm not active on the civil society part, conventional civil society part. But in the context of the COP, the civil society has played a big role. Actually, in one of my papers last year, I called their role in the COP process. They provide what I call the people's COP. The people's COP. There's an underrated contribution of civil society to the COP process, and that contribution is capacity building. Although civil society can be narrow in terms of their focus and interests, one can comment about who funds them and what narrative are they driving. But in the COP process itself, civil society has been instrumental in building capacities, in particular of delegates from the developing countries. I said that was the last point, but please allow me to comment on this. climate change is not the only challenge that is facing the world today. The first two speakers this morning reminded us about that eloquently. I want to remind you, because you know this. In Africa, currently, there's a war in Sudan. There's a war in Ethiopia in the Tigray region. There's a war in DRC. So as we respond to climate change in Africa, we are forced to treat it as a complex issue. There's development, there's security, there's climate change. This is a reminder to you that even in Africa, we have similar challenges that you face here. They may not be profiled as in other regions, but perhaps all lives matter. Thank you, Carol.
Thank you very much, Brian. 2 points I'd like to pick up. I work for a Center for Policy, and we talk about science-policy interface, but it is really, especially for this session and what's happening, is a science-politics nexus. And that is really the challenge of bringing people together to determine whose role is to what under the current circumstances and with the multiplicity of challenges we face. And I would like to commend the UAE on this, because we haven't seen in a COP before a thematic day. It will actually be the first thematic day of the COP coming up in a couple weeks on relief, recovery, and peace. We talk about water. Egypt really took leadership on water. We had talked about agriculture. I think given the crises happening globally and realizing that we have to address climate change in these multi-dimensional, complicated context is quite challenging and quite actually responsive to adding to the list of issues that this audience on security as we vision forward need to consider. So I'm going to open the floor for questions, comments, for anyone who would like. I'm actually not quite sure how you raise your hand, but if you have an inquiry, please. Yeah, I don't have a name yet. So how do they select, if I might ask? Do people know how to select their name on the dashboard?
Sorry, yeah. They
Please.
know, and there is instructions.
Oh, here we are.
But you can go ahead with the speakers until you get...
Okay, yes. I have Ibtisam, sorry.
I am the one.
Oh, sorry, Doctora, sorry. If anyone has a comment, if not, I'm going to ask the panels to go through. I'm sure there's comments on the linkage between climate, security, peace, and recovery, especially since the UAE is such a huge donor on humanitarian efforts. There's a lot of discussion on the nexus, actually, between humanitarian development communities. Is anyone would like to raise on this right now?
May you please continue discussing with the panelists until you get the names? Thank you.
Sure. So, on this issue on climate justice, perhaps. Climate justice has many aspects. It has to do between countries, within countries, with how we proceed. Would someone like to take on that issue? Zaheer, would you like to mention maybe the negotiations, perhaps on the finance side, how important climate justice plays with that, and making sure that the resources are available?
Sure. I think maybe I should draw on the example, in my previous life I was the head of the international division in South Africa and also involved in the Just Energy Transition Program, or the JETP as they call it. One of the key things that we recognized is that there's a lot of emphasis globally on the climate agenda, but climate agenda doesn't operate in a silo. And if you look at the Paris Agreement and everything else, it talks of climate action in the context of sustainable development and poverty eradication. And often you're finding that we are talking largely about transitioning from energy sectors, and we phase out something, phasing out coal and all of these things. But one does not come into the discussion is how do you do it in a responsible manner? I'll give you an example in South Africa, in one area, in the Mpumalanga area. It's an area that has a coal mining history, and also an area that has coal power stations. If we were to shut down that coal power station, that is over 400,000 people will lose their lives and livelihoods. And it's not just a matter of closing down a coal power station and that, because each person working in there is supporting a family. There are businesses that are being, and so whenever you're looking at these kind of transitions, you need to look at the justice and the equity about these things. And most of the sources of finance you get only deals with the climate elements of it. It does not provide you with the social safeguards. It does not provide you with how do you create new economic opportunities and livelihoods for people.
And that's where the adaptive capacity is fundamental, and the issue of resilience needs to be brought into the equation. It's not just one event, it's the whole integrated approach as development. We do have an inquiry before I turn back. Hamdi Atallah, if you'd like to turn on your mic and pose your question.
How do you do that? Thank you very much. I want to elaborate on what Brian said about the nexus between climate change and security and conflict. We're always talking about the mitigation, resilience, and finance of climate change. But the correlation between climate change and conflict, especially in Africa and the most vulnerable society, is not, there's a gap in literature all the time. So look for the conflict between the herders and the farmers in many African communities, or you have some kind of relation between terrorism, how the terrorist organization recruit new members based on the environment of vulnerability due to climate change. So the idea of how to study the relationship between the conflict and climate change, is it a kind of amplifier that enhance the vulnerability of societies and add more complicity to the the crisis of climate change? This is why we consider climate change as a new non-traditional threat to society, where you need a more collaborative and cooperative response, which goes beyond the capacity of any individual state. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hamdi. Yes, the idea of climate change as a threat multiplier, very controversial issue, and on both directions. Let me take a couple more questions and then turn back to the panel. I see Al-Badr Al-Shateri. If you can just raise your hand and introduce yourself, please.
Okay. Thank you very much. My name is Al-Badr Al-Shateri from National Defense College. I just have a question. Environmental issues takes place in a context of international relation. And today we have high level of polarization in the international system. Could we use the environmental issues to bring about cooperation, or conversely, could those issues be politicized that it will prevent any solution to what we are facing in international or environmental challenge? Thank you.
Yes, and is it only through multilateral agreements, environmental agreements, that needs to be used for those purposes? Again, hold on to those questions. There's one more comment, and then I'll come back. Marwan El-Kerkshi, I'm sorry, I apologize for the spelling, for the pronunciation.
Yes, hello.
Yes.
Marwan El-Kreikshi.
Thank you.
From CMI, Finland. So just a question on the gap identified between the, let's say, the scientific community and the political sphere, or the foreign and security policy circles, or these other, let's say, circles that are not that convinced. How do we bridge the gap? Do you have any ideas on how to go about that? Thank you.
Bridging the gap. Okay. And one last one before we turn back to our panel. Oh, there's two. Ali Al-Amoudi.
Yes, I'm Dr. Ali Al-Amoudi. I'm a former UNDP Sustainable Development Advisor. I've been through several meetings of COP, as a matter of fact, and you know, this issue has been tackled when it comes to the concern of the LDC, the least developing countries, as our speaker here from Africa, he mentioned this issue. This issue, the COP28 UAE here is tackling it in a very serious matter, especially when it comes to the solutions that can be tackled concerning the changes and impact on the very poor or the least poor countries in Africa and other parts of the world. Now, and of course, one of the resilience, you know, results that will come out is that they will concentrate on the green funding of this COP. My question is, to what extent that we feel that the previous COP conferences and meetings and the political issue have raised this issue to the concern of the implementation. They always say that there will be funding, there will be supporting the least developing countries, the LDCs, but to be honest, the percentage of success of the result is not that sufficient, which gives the people, the poor people in the rest of the world, the ability, you know, that they can survive, they can live, you know. So my question is, to what extent COP28 is endorsing this issue exactly? Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, and bringing that up with LDCs, where they're only receiving actually 7% of all public international flows for climate finance are only going to LDCs. Now, there's a lot of questions here, and I have 2 more on the request list. Can I just ask the organizer, shall I ask this, and then we go back? Because I don't know. Okay. We'll ask 2 more, and then we'll turn in, and I think it's closing statements. We're a little bit late on the program. Nabil Fahmy? Yes.
Thank you.
Dr. Fahmy.
Thank you all for your presentations. You all emphasized that these issues are interrelated, and I completely agree with you. But I want to put you a little bit under more pressure. All the COPs ultimately were known for either a particular success or a particular failure. What would you envisage to be the most important thing we need to achieve at COP28?
Putting us under pressure there. Okay, and last question I have from Shahabuddin Aisha. Essa? Mr. Essa? Yes.
Fahmy, I was the former Environment Minister of Egypt, and I'm working now as an advisor for the Emirates Strategic and Political Research Center. I'd like to, my greetings to Zaheer. We have worked together in Paris Agreement. It's nice to see you again. And I'll go straight to my, to some expectation that I think will happen. And this is related to what His Excellency, Mr. Nabil Fahmy, had just raised. In my opinion, I see that the success will be majorly in 2 things: the just transition of energy, provided that the language is a little bit changed to include low carbon fossil fuel because of the security, the issues of the energy security. I do expect that we will have a breakthrough in the fund for loss and damage, but provided that the wealthy nation will take the big contribution, and wealthy nation is identified differently a little bit from what we used to call them. These are not the industrialized, but these are the wealthy nations. So if I expect this is going to be, there may be a breakthrough. We do expect also that there will be a breakthrough when it comes to gender and youth. There will be a big strength on this. As for adaptation, I do not think that we will reach a common global goal for adaptation, finance will not be as we expect in developing countries, and that will be postponed to future COPs. On ambitious, when it comes to mitigation, I think the language is going to be changed, and I think there will be more flexibility in that. Zaheer, maybe you can elaborate on these expectations. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for Your Excellency, and thank you all for very insightful questions and showing that intersection. I think we're coming up, so I'm going to ask all the panelists to just comment on the questions that they'd like. Dr. Aisha, if you don't mind starting, and we'll bring it out this way, please respond to those very insightful comments that were provided.
Well, thank you very much for these questions. I think all of the questions go under the theme on how to make a COP28 a different COP and how to come with concrete outcomes out of COP28. I think COP28 will make a success, and because COP28 is the first COP ever to conclude the first global stocktake. Now, since the Paris Agreement, we have been negotiating how countries can mitigate greenhouse gas emissions and how can countries adapt to the climate change. But now, with this COP, we are transitioning from ambition to action, and global stocktake is a measurement tool for the collective progress of countries or on where we stand today and where we need to be in the future. So with this global stocktake, countries will be assessed on their progress, and if a country needs to make more progress, it will be requested to do so, and it will need to do so by 2025. And this is kind of going to create a momentum for everyone to take the responsibility. But it will, of course, requires a political will. But now I am hoping that because this is a COP, the 28th meeting, I think we have made a lot of progress on the climate negotiations. I understand there's a question on the, the adaptation and closing the gap between the North and the South. The UAE has been, even before the COP, holding meetings in advancing the commitment of the global North to, commit to the $100 billion US to be transferred to the developing countries. Now, 100 billion is not enough. Now we have identified that to achieve climate goals, we need trillions of dollars to do so. And so the countries have come to a new quantified adaptation target, and that will start to be negotiated in 2024. Okay. And then also in terms of the loss and damage fund, which was established last year in Sharm el-Sheikh, now this year the challenge is, to make this fund operational. Already the pre-COP meetings, the countries, although there has been tension on where the fund will be hosted and who will contribute to the fund and how the cash will flow between countries, last week or so in Abu Dhabi, there was agreement that the fund initially will be hosted by the World Bank before moving to a next step on establishing a new fund for the loss and damage, where the developing countries can have access to the fund more freely.
Thank you. Okay. Do you want to just a closing point?
Okay. What I want also to, one last thing on the polarization and then whether the climate issues will be used as a weapon or entry point of cooperation. We tend to be optimistic when it comes to the solutions. Now, it can be used as a weapon because, countries will prioritize their own interest when, dealing with the climate issues like water scarcity. But we also think that, because of the growing awareness globally, climate issues can be an entry point of cooperation. And on that note, I would like to say, in the next few weeks, we will publish a volume which speaks about the regional environmental cooperation in the Gulf. So please, stay tuned.
Thank you, and congratulations on this new research. Dr. Brian, is there some of those points you'd like to focus on? And I know that you had wanted to talk also about adaptation of the process, so please feel free in your closing remarks to address that.
Thanks, Carol. And being the second speaker, it gives me time to prepare my input. Thank you. I will leave the issue of the finance gap to Zaheer, and the question of the LDCs to Zaheer, and also the question on the COP outcomes. Please, Zaheer, respond to those. I have views, but I would like to hear your views. I will comment on three things. The role of the environmental conversations in bringing global consensus on issues beyond environment. I have one point to make there. I want to remind you again that one of the key successes of the climate change discourse, the reason that the climate change discourse has been elevated economically and socially, one of the reasons is that the global climate community removed it from the environmental sector. Climate change is not an environmental issue. And that is a point that has elevated climate change. I will leave it to you to where you locate it, but it is not an environmental issue. It is way broader than that. Second, on the issue of security, the question about conducting research in security, this is a field that I am entering in the last few years. I've just entered in the last few years. One of the lessons that I've learned is what I call asymmetry. I find that we researchers come with preconceived ideas as we engage with the affected communities. In my view, we as researchers need to learn how to engage affected communities so that we fully appreciate and understand their perspectives and merge them with our theories of change and theoretical frameworks that we develop in our offices. So there's that conversion that I have not yet figured out how to do, but I think it's necessary. Lastly, for me, on the issue of the success of COP, and this is for me, I would measure the success of COP28 on one aspect, the extent to which UAE maintains the momentum that we received from Egypt last year on two aspects, loss and damage and global goal on adaptation. Two aspects, the momentum on loss and damage, political momentum on loss and damage, political momentum on adaptation. And the reason for this, Carol, to close, is because climate change is not a future issue for Africa. It's not for future generations. In the period between 2025 and 2035, that is the period we're going to see the impacts of climate change, irrespective of the extent of mitigation that happens in that period. We are locked into seeing the impacts of climate change. So if we do less than adequate on adaptation, we are shooting ourselves in the foot. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Much appreciated. And turning to the advisor of the negotiations inside the box, Fakir, would you like to give some closing remarks building on what we've heard?
Thank you very much, and I thank my colleagues here for leaving all the difficult questions for me to answer. I think the first thing we need to recognize is, and as Brian was saying, climate change is no longer an environmental issue. It touches, it's a fundamental development issue, it's a fundamental economic issue. And you will also recognize today that it will shape the future developmental trajectories going forward. We've seen climate change becoming an issue in the trade area. You look at CBAM, IRA, all these new kind of things. So I think we cannot ignore the climate change issue, nor can we just leave it to the issue of environment. It's going to shape our future economic activities. You see the scramble for resources, you see the scramble for new technologies, be it in renewables, electric vehicles, everything. This is going to shape the future. One of the things that will shape the future of finance is a very conspicuous article in the Paris Agreement called Article 21C. You will hear more and more of this Article 21C coming up at the COP. And this article basically talks about how we make financial flows consistent with low greenhouse gas and climate resilient development pathways. And this will shape the future financing architecture for the future for world. So it's something that we need to recognize. What we're going to get out in this COP, maybe I should draw on the message that the word impossible does not exist in the UAE, in its vocabulary. So I foresee us having a successful operationalization of the Loss and Damage Fund with some successful pledges. I would see us taking a decision on the framework for the global goal on adaptation. I would see us pushing for not doubling adaptation finance, but quadrupling it by 2030, so that we catch up with the gap that is there. I would see us seeing significant strides on the finance side in making financial institutions fit for purpose. I will see us seeing much greater access, scale of public money, but in the form that allows us to be able to leverage greater multiples of private capital. I would see this issue of debt being seriously addressed, given the high levels of debt and the fact that that would exacerbate. And I would see, lastly, a much greater emphasis on the issue of just transition and equity going forward, because I would see the convergence of the climate agenda, the environmental agenda, and the development agenda forging to become one agenda, and the whole process of sustainable development moving forward. Thank you.
Excellent. If all that is achieved, I think we'll be really in very good shape to move forward. Let's hope that that is realized thanks to the leadership of the UAE here. We do need finance. I do highlight there are the other means of implementation. There is the technology, the capacity building, and the governance. I think you've heard here, and especially with this esteemed audience here, climate change is well beyond the environment. It is an existential threat. It's not only a threat to conflict risks and a contributor to conflict risks, it is an influencing factor for our entire development pathways as we move forward, not only under the Paris Agreement, but under the UN's mandated Sustainable Development Goals as we look forward to an inclusive, integrated, stable, and hopefully a more sustainable future. I'd like to thank our distinguished panel, Mr. Zaheer Fakir, Dr. Aisha Shaheen, and Dr. Brian Mantlana for an excellent panel, and I look forward to speaking on the sidelines with all of you as we move forward. Thank you.